Welcome to The Definitive Wrap, where we report the truth about American exceptionalism. We love our flag, we love our country, and we believe in America. The Definitive Wrap, where we respect people of faith, the men and women in blue, and our support for Israel. And now your hosts, Bela Sebro, she's the nice one, and Alan Skorsky. He's not so nice. But together they are The Definitive Wrap.
I'm Alan Skorsky with my co-host Bela Sebro, and welcome to The Definitive Wrap. We thank Vin News for hosting our show. I have always been fascinated by books written by those who traveled back to Europe to investigate and research the lives of their ancestors who lived through the Holocaust. Today's guest, Meriel Schindler, whom Bela will introduce shortly, is the author of The Lost Café Schindler. Café Schindler was built by her uncles, Hugo and Erich, in the early 1900s, and was considered the place to be in Innsbruck, Austria, where they served the best pastries and featured the most talented musicians for dance nights. The cafe, though under a different name, is still operating today. This book, however, is not about a cafe, but about family history, Nazi plundering of Jewish businesses and property, attempts at reclamation, and a search for truth and closure years after the war. Our guest discovered her father's papers in 2017 after his passing, which served as a link to his family back in Austria, going back to the late 1800s and early 1900s, including family members who served in the Austrian military during World War I. Meriel discovers that her great-uncle, Edward Bloch, was an incredible medical doctor who took care of everyone, rich and poor, at any time of day or night. Meriel Schindler discovers that her Uncle Edward was given special protection during the Nazi onslaught of Austria because during the early 1900s, Dr. Bloch treated Hitler's mother for breast cancer and treated young Adolf Hitler himself. There were a lot of lessons from this book, which showed that even Jews who were fully assimilated with their non-Jewish neighbors were not spared from the Nuremberg laws or Nazi-inspired anti-Semitism. And as the author wrote, there were so few Jews in this part of Austria for neo-Nazis to even blame their problems on. We will talk about this and the rest of her fascinating book during today's show. Bela?
Thank you, Alan. I often talk about being a child of Holocaust survivors, and as such, anything remotely familiar with the topic, I will get my hands on to read. It never ceases to amaze me that no matter how many years pass by, there are always more stories that come to the surface, bringing the atrocities to life again and again. This is part of history. The Holocaust will never, ever be forgotten. The book, The Lost Café Schindler, One Family, Two Wars, and the Search for Truth, which was published by W.W. Norton on October 12th, centers around the Café Schindler, the social hub of Innsbruck. Famous for its pastries, as Alan said, home distilled liquors, live entertainment, and hospitality, the cafe became an eyewitness to the history that we know. As conditions for the Jews became unbearable, the Schindlers were forced to leave, and the cafe was no longer the place for jazz and apple strudel, but a place for Nazi officers to go clubbing and drinking. I remember quite a few years ago, I read the book written by Bridget Hammond that is based on a diary of Dr. Edward Bloch, who treated Hitler's mother for breast cancer, something of the Lost Café Schindler touches upon as well. This is a true story about our guest's grandfather, Hugo's Cafe, but it is really also about making true what had been falsified by her father, Kurt. The Lost Café Schindler recreates the journey of an extraordinary family whose relatives, according to Kurt, included the Jewish doctor who treated Hitler's mother when she was dying of breast cancer, Franz Kafka, Oskar Schindler, and Alma Schindler, the wife of Gustav Mahler. But was any of that true? Let's find out. Our guest, Meriel Schindler, is an employment lawyer, partner, and head of a team at Withers LLP, a law firm, and is the patron of Arvon, the writing charity. She lives in London with her husband, Jeremy, and has 3 adult children. This is her first book, and I'm sure one of many to follow. Meriel, all the way from London, welcome to the Definitive Wrap.
It's an honor and a pleasure to join you from London.
Meriel,
thank you very much.
Meriel, you have written this book, and not just as an author recounting history as you have heard or researched, but the reader can sense your dynamic personality. You are bringing this book to life. My question is, as you unravel your family history, including the truth behind what happened on Kristallnacht when the Nazis beat your grandfather and left him for dead, can you please share with our audience the untold story of the fate of the Jews of Western Austria and about the rise of anti-Semitism and the Nazi occupation?
Thank you very much. You've done a very, very good job summarizing it between the two of you. I think what is interesting about this part of Austria is that most people, when they think about Austria, they think about Vienna. Vienna was overrun with Jews. They formed 10% of the population in Vienna. In Western Austria, so where Innsbruck is situated in the Tyrol, in the mountains, there were very, very few Jews. But that's not to say that there wasn't anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism lay beneath the surface and was rife. Now, the Jews that did exist and lived very happily in Innsbruck were largely very assimilated, and they formed a tiny fraction of the population of Innsbruck, where most of my family came from. And they were largely merchants and business people, and certainly my grandfather was born and bred in the Tyrol, and he loved the Tyrol. So for him, in a sense, the peak of his assimilation as a person, as a citizen of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was the moment in 1914 when he put on his Kaiser's uniform. He put on Kaiser Franz Josef's uniform, and he fought for his Kaiser. He fought for the Austro-Hungarian Empire and to stop it disintegrating. So that was clearly a pivotal moment in his young life. And he fought both on the Eastern Front, but mostly on the Southern Front. And that is, in a sense, a part of the First World War that's not been very often described. I mean, the Americans are very lucky because they had Hemingway, who describes it in A Farewell to Arms. But that's pretty much the only description that we have in contemporary literature of it. And there aren't even that many historical books on it. I think there's one American academic who, oddly enough, is called Schindler, and another, a British academic who's written about it. It was called the White War. And why was it called the White War? It was fought on mountainous slopes. So when we think of the First World War, we have images often, certainly for the British, and I think largely for the Americans, of Flanders, of the mud, of the trenches, of endless flat land, blasted landscapes. But this was very different. This was fought up in the mountains on really vertiginous slopes. And it was a very intimate war. It was the Austrians largely fighting the Italians. The Austrians were largely on the top of the mountains, and the Italians were largely fighting their way up the mountains. You can imagine how that didn't go very well for most of the Italians. And it was intimate in the sense that the fronts were often 6-12 feet apart. People were cowering behind very, very low walls in this war. And it was a brutal war. It was a really brutal war. And you were as likely to get swept off the mountain by an avalanche as you were to die from a gas attack that you couldn't foresee where it was going to come from because of the winds. And you were often, as a soldier, stranded up on top of a mountain for weeks and weeks at a time. You could die of toothache, you could die of tonsillitis, or you could die of a sniper's bullet. So it was a really, really, I mean, all war is horrible, but it was, I think, a particularly brutal war. And particularly brutal for someone who loved mountains. My grandfather adored the mountains. So he survived. One of his brothers didn't. One of his brothers died, but he returned to Innsbruck. And Innsbruck at that point was a broken city. It was destitute. The various treaties that the Allies had, in their wisdom, imposed on Germany and Austria had basically led to utter destitution. We know that the Treaty of Versailles was very much repudiated by the Germans, and we had the Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye in Austria. What that did is it stripped the empire, which had by then fallen apart, into its constituent parts and left it as a rump state which effectively couldn't feed itself. And that was particularly the case in Innsbruck. So Innsbruck's surrounded by mountains, and it had drawn a lot of its goods to keep itself going from the South Tyrol, what became Italy. And that's the bit over the Brenner Pass had been gifted to the Italians after the First World War as recompense for coming into the war. And so, you know, my grandfather returned to this destitute city, which was, you know, economically on its knees. Kids were starving in the street, and he did the most extraordinary thing. He opened a cafe, a dance cafe. Utterly frivolous against that economic backdrop, and it was hugely successful. So anyone danced there. And when I went to school in Austria, when I was 15, I went to school in Austria. Even with my name, and even though it was decades after the cafe hadn't existed, the moment I mentioned my name to the parents of my friends or to the grandparents of my friends, they went, "Oh, the Café Schindler. I used to dance there. I used to meet my boyfriend in secret there." So it would absolutely lived on in the zeitgeist of the people who lived in the town. And, you know, it was a very special place. It was a triple-fronted building on the main street. And as you say, it was an eyewitness to history. Anything that happened in that small town flowed beneath the windows of the cafe. So it absorbed, in a sense, the history of that time. You roll on to 1938, as you rightly say, the Nazis arrived, and the first thing they did was move into our villa. We owned the nicest house in town, and they took the cafe and the liquor factory and the jam factory off my grandparents. And they then emigrated in various stages at various times, and they emigrated to London. That's why I'm ostensibly British, but I also have an Austrian passport nowadays.
You know,
that's
so
a little bit of a story.
One of the reasons I loved your book, I mean, I loved it, that you brought so much history there, because I read a lot of books, and I have a treasure trove of books about the Holocaust. I still try to wrap my head around everything. My parents were both born in France. I'll tell you about that a little bit later. But when historians write books about this, you know, they write long books because they want to prove their mettle as a historian. I'm a PhD, so I'm going to give you PhD. Your book was very human about the history of the rise of anti-Semitism. So let me go back to the beginning. You had a troubled relationship with your father. It happens. And you said he was a hoarder. I'm the same way, which is why I have this background instead of the background of my apartment. And you're going through the paper, all the papers you left, and I'm guessing you didn't expect, like you open up, okay, here's a piece of paper from this, paper, that, and that, garbage, and then you're like, uh-oh, there's stuff here. So what did you pick up, and what stuck with you that, oh my God, there was so much more to my father and history that kind of set you off on your journey to go back in time?
I think it really was a search for truth, Alan. When you say I had a troubled relationship with my father, I mean, that is absolutely true. I mean, my father was tall, handsome, he was a raconteur, he was incredibly entertaining, but he had a terribly distant relationship with truth, or put another way, as a lawyer, I would say he was a liar. He lied about a lot of things. But there was often a tiny grain of something that was the origin that was probably true, but it was embellished. So when he died, I was left with an awful, he died destitute, and I was left with a lot of anecdotes in my head. And being a lawyer is something, it almost compelled me to try and find out what had actually happened. I had, for a large part of my adult life, discounted many of the stories he told, because when he said, oh, we're related to Kafka, or we're related to Alma Mahler, or related to Bruno Kreisky, the first president of Austria after the war, I just said, yeah, how? And he could never answer that. And this is obviously pre-internet as well. So, I think he'd have had great fun with online genealogy personally. And so what compelled me to pick up the papers in his cottage and sift through them was, first of all, to make sure we were chucking out the right stuff. And it was the most, it was like, when people talk about a Kafkaesque mess, it was absolutely that. There were towering papers, piles on every surface, on the floor, everywhere. And we went down there. I went down with my sister and our two husbands, and we tried to sift this stuff to try and pack up what we thought was relevant and important. And I didn't know at that point I was going to write a book. In fact, I boxed up a lot of the papers because I felt they were too frightening to look at. They were emblazoned with swastikas, and although I read fluent German, reading through stuff with your family name on it and Heil Hitler all over it is not a pleasant thing to do. So I largely boxed them up. But the thing I came back to time and again were photo albums. Now, oddly, these were family photo albums that I'd never seen. Some of them had been in the attic and I hadn't ever seen them, and some of them had been hanging around, but I wasn't interested in them as a kid. They're tiny black and white photos. They're not terribly engaging, and like so many photo albums from that era, and I'm sure it's the same for both your families, they didn't write the names underneath them. They expected to be able to orally pass on who is in the picture. And of course, he was gone. And I had no idea who were these people in long frocks with bonnets on sledges. What the most inappropriate thing to be, on a toboggan in a long frock. Who were these people? And so I was curious. I've always been curious, and I was trying to. It was a search for truth. It was to try and work out who we related to, whether any of the stories he told were true, and I suppose to try and lay to rest what had been, a really quite a troubled relationship with him. And I think that's what I largely did in it.
Layla?
Meriel, you talk about your father, Kurt, who had either a faulty memory or an interesting relationship with the truth. So what were some of the more outlandish things he told you about your family, and were any of them ever true?
I think there are two very good examples, and they are at opposite ends of the spectrum, okay? So the first one is the Kristallnacht story, and the second one is the Bloch story. So the Kristallnacht story, which, nowadays people tend to call this the November pogrom, because Kristallnacht is simply too poetic a name for what was actually a night of hideous violence. And the way my father told that story was that, some Nazi thugs knocked on the door in the middle of the night. He was present. My father said he witnessed the fact that they broke into the flat that they were living in, and they picked up a toboggan, his childhood toboggan, my father's childhood toboggan, one of those classic Austrian toboggans, beautiful wooden hoop toboggan with metal runners underneath it to stop the wood splintering on the snow. And they smashed the toboggan over my grandfather's head. And my father described that to me. He described it to my kids. And we grew up with this story that he was an eyewitness to this horrendous attack on his father, my grandfather. There's only one thing wrong with that story. The attack took place. My father was 13 and he was safely in London. And I have categoric evidence of that because I have his childhood photo album where he writes in it, first day in London with mummy, September 1938. Now, there's no way on this earth that his mother, who was in London, sent him back to Austria. She just had him rescued from Austria. He wasn't there. He was never there. But he used this story of being an eyewitness to a severe beating, which my grandfather survived, but only just. He was very, very lucky. He used this business of being an eyewitness to something as horrific as your father being beaten up in front of you as essentially an excuse for the way he behaved most of his life, and as well as a lot of other things that he said happened to him. So that story happened, but there was the key part of it that he was witness to it didn't happen. That was made up. And when I look back on it, it's very difficult. Memory is a very tricky thing. And I think even, as a lawyer, when I take a witness statement from someone, I have to be very, very careful not to prompt them too much, not to put stuff in front of them, evidence in front of them that creates false memory. You're looking for true testimony. You have to download it from the person and then you have to test it. And with him, what I think happened, he overwrote and he told this story repeatedly And I think he came to believe it, because he certainly, I don't think he understood he was lying. So that's the one story. Now, the other story that I had always believed, the Kristallnacht story, the other story by contrast that I never believed and totally discounted was the fact that he said, my uncle was a nice doctor in Upper Austria, in Linz, Hitler's favorite town, and he treated Hitler's mother, and he treated Hitler, and he was Jewish. Now, as far as I was concerned, this was a nonsense, because, you know, Hitler, certainly, although he didn't start out necessarily as a Jew hater, he obviously became one when he moved to Vienna, and it seemed to me utterly incredible that his family would have been treated by a Jewish doctor. It also seemed pretty incredible that the Jewish doctor would have survived the war. However, when I researched it, I found that there was indeed a Dr. Bloch. I went to Linz, and it's clear that he lived there. And you know, you can find traces of him in the local archives. He was a staunch member of the local Jewish community. But more to the point, he emigrated very late to New York, and his own personal testimony, all 42 pages of closely written script, is in the Washington Holocaust Museum, one of the most brilliant museums in the world. And you know, I requested that they digitalize it, which they have now done, and you can read his own account of the days that he treated Hitler, and how Clara Hitler, Hitler's mother, in 1907 arrived in his surgery. He describes her as a good-looking woman in her middle age with very luminescent grey eyes, a very sort of beautiful woman, and she's complaining of terrible chest pain. And the good doctor, he's been trained in women's medicine, and he pretty much guesses what's wrong, and he takes her name and he examines her and discovers she's got advanced breast cancer. And he doesn't tell her at that moment that it's pretty much a death sentence, as the doctor says it in his biography. He sends her away and says, look, come back with your family, and I'm going to explain what will need to happen. A couple of days later, she reappears in the surgery, and she has young Adolf Hitler, age 17, in tow. And the good doctor explains that she will need a double mastectomy and that he will organize it. And the effect, and he describes the effect on Adolf Hitler, who is an adolescent boy who clearly adores his mother. Absolutely, he talks about the strong bond that he can see between them, and how there are tears streaming down Adolf Hitler's face, and that he promises to do his best for Clara. And he organizes the operation. He is present during the operation, and the moment the operation is over, he goes and visits the young family and says, look, it's gone as well as can be expected. We'll just have to see how she recovers. And she makes a bit of a recovery. I mean, she dies about a year later. And, he looks after her in a very dedicated fashion throughout that period. Hitler is on the scene there. He takes over some of the household chores, and, they have a bond. And, roll on to 1938, Hitler arrives back in Linz, his favorite city. He hated Vienna. He has huge plans for Linz. It's his town. He's going to build art galleries. In fact, all he does actually is build the Hermann Goering works just outside Linz, which is then very much a goal of bombing for the Allies. But anyway, and Hitler arrives back in Linz, this huge, invading hero, if you like, to crowds on the street, to adulation. And one of the things he asks is my doctor still alive? The good Dr. Bloch? And some of the cronies say, yeah, he's still alive. And he goes, yeah, if all Jews were like him, we wouldn't have a problem. So he really was this protected man. And that story was repeated by various people to his daughter. So it's got, good roots. And he really was protected. And so whenever there was some new law that came out that they had to give in their ration cards or have a J stamped on it, or had their phones taken away, none of that applied to Dr. Bloch. So his little flat in Linz became a sort of meeting point for all the Jews who were trying to escape from Austria, from that part of Austria. And he tried to help and eventually emigrated himself. And there's some fantastic tales around that time, around, how the fact that, Hitler, when he'd gone to Vienna, had sent him a couple of postcards saying, one of them was one of those hand-painted ones that Hitler, we know, did in Vienna, and he hand-painted it and gave it that sort of antique appearance by sort of drying it in front of a gas fire. And he signed it, "You're eternally grateful, Hitler." And so, and oddly, the doctor had kept these tiny mementos from this patient. And when the Nazis arrived in Linz in 1938, they took the cards off him. And Bloch had this sort of eternal mission to try and track down the cards. And he presented himself to the chief of the SS, which was a very brave thing to do for a Jewish doctor at that time. And the head of the SS sort of sits him down and says, "Well, I'd love to hear about my Führer and how you treated him." And, it's also a very warm and sort of congenial atmosphere. And he says, "Well, I don't understand why the cards were taken off you. Are you in some way politically suspect?" And the doctor goes, No, I've just been dedicated to, looking after people as a doctor." And suddenly it dawns on this SS officer that he's actually got a Jew in front of him, and that he's greeted him warmly. And Bloch describes how a wall of ice is thrown up, and the man can barely bring himself to shake hands with him at the end of the interview. And he leans across and says, "Yeah, but your Führer shook hands with me on many occasions." And it's like this sort of perfect riposte to this SS officer who's suddenly been taken unawares that he's been actually entertaining a Jew in his office rather than beating them up on the streets, which is what he was normally doing. So it's quite it's a lovely sort of vignette of that period and that time, and a very exceptional man. And it was completely true, but I, of course, totally discounted it when I was growing up because it just seemed incredible.
Right. So it's funny, when I first read about it early in the book, I thought, okay, here's an interesting, footnote of the book. She discovers that her uncle treated, little Hitler and his mother. But then later on, you're right, about more extensively, as you just mentioned, he was given special privileges. He was protected. And I was just wondering, in your mind, because you're a very inquisitive person, did it make you think, because it made me think, that there were many Jewish doctors in Europe, and Hitler said, "Oh," and so did say, "Wait a second, here was one good Jew. There were tons of Jewish doctors. Were there other Nazis who said, wait a second, we got to be good to him because he treated you? We know Jewish doctors also. So wait a second, are we turning on the Jews? Are we not?" Did any of this make you wonder how this one Jewish doctor stood out and how it didn't breed resentment amongst other Nazis? I don't know.
I don't know. I don't know. There is the term Edeljude, which is noble. Edel is noble, noble Jew. And this is apparently a term that was used amongst the sort of Nazi hierarchy. And I think there were occasional other examples of sort of, it's a bit like a white person saying, I've got a black friend sometimes, that sort of tokenism of, okay, this is an exceptional person, I'm going to protect them. And I think there's a little bit of that going on. I don't think it had any effect really on, obviously, what was going on for the vast majority of the Jews in Austria. We lost 65,000 Jews in Austria. And as has been said, the Austrians were very, very good anti-Semites. They were not so good Nazis, but they were very good anti-Semites.
Meriel, did you know that you were Jewish growing up?
I did, but it's a very poignant question, because my father was one of that generation who said to us, "Don't tell anyone you were Jewish." So we were very, very. He married out. My mother was not Jewish, and he was very clear that this was a secret and you shouldn't tell anyone. Now, from his point of view, I can see that, being Jewish was dangerous. So I can see that, you can interpret it in lots of ways. You can say he's a, self-hating Jew, or you can say, actually, he was just trying to protect his two daughters, and, in a world that he felt was uncertain and unsafe. And he always felt the world was unsafe. If it wasn't Nazis, there were communists. If it wasn't communists, there were socialists. Frankly, the world was a very unsafe place from his point of view.
When you first began your journey, again, I didn't know how far you thought this was ever going to go. but you bring your kids with you. And I read in your book that your kids went with you through the Alps. And I'm thinking, as a kid, were they saying, Mom, I want to stay home and play with my Xbox. Why are you doing this to me? Or were they like, were they as intrigued as you were, saying, you know what, this is cool. Grandpa Kurt, you know, had some cool stories. You know, how was your family support with all of this?
I think my family were amazingly forgiving. As I disappeared for weeks at a time into 1938 and basically lived there for 3 years, I thought they were phenomenally forgiving. I mean, I have to say I did engage in a bit of sleight of hand, so that you know, when I talked about the fantastic whitewater rafting holiday we were going to go to in Slovenia, really at the back of my head was of this extraordinary First World War museum in Kobarid I wanted to see, which happens to be near a whitewater rafting centre. So we had to combine these things. So it was whitewater rafting one day, and then it was, let's walk up this mountain so that we can look at the trenches the next day. Now, they happen to be quite sort of athletic kids, and they do like mountain walking. But a 7-hour hike up Mount Krun to look at various First World War fortifications was a little bit on the long side for some of them. So,
yeah, but in the end, they were probably as amazed as you were about the whole story.
Yeah, I mean, they're very proud of the book, right. And I think, you know, they watched me struggle with my relationship with my father, and I think they feel happy that I have unraveled that to such an extent that I feel I've laid that to peace.
Okay. Bela?
I love how descriptive you are, Meriel. So can you please describe Café Schindler? Can you bring us there, recreate the setting? I mean, you're just amazing. I love how you sound, and I just love how you describe things. And I just want to picture it right now, and really for our audience sake, because I read the book, I'm picturing it, but, you know, bring our audience there.
Okay, so please. Let's imagine we are 1928, 29, around that sort of time. Sort of, you imagine in the US, you've got your jazz era, just pretty much going full blast at that point. And what my grandfather managed to create was a jazz era in miniature. He loved music. So you would go in through the shop on the ground floor, which sold wooden boxes of chocolates and crystallized fruit and coffee. And you would go up a beautiful sweeping staircase with a beautiful, and I've seen pictures of it, with a beautiful banister, wooden banister that takes you up to the first floor. And as you arrive at the first floor, this is not some restaurant where you just sit down on your own. You are shown to a banquette. And you're shown to a banquette by a maître d', who takes your hat and coat, and you settle at your banquette, and you can look out of the window, and the banquettes are at right angles to the window. So you can see straight up to the mountains, and you can just see the Baroque bit of the old part of town. And aside from that, the sort of frontage of the houses opposite are very pretty, again, very Baroque, lots of different colours, beautiful carvings. And you probably order, what are we ordering, Bela, today? Coffee and cake, maybe? Yeah, maybe coffee and strudel, apple strudel. And that's brought to you on a starched white tablecloth by a waiter with a glass of water, and it's brought to you in style, and there's a bit of style. And if you're on your own, that's fine. You sit and you read the newspaper. That's brought to you stretched on those lovely wooden poles. This is a classic European coffee house, the same that you would see in Vienna, the same that you would see in Paris. And in a sense, those coffee houses were places to hang out. I mean, when you guys brought Starbucks to the world, you were reinventing the coffee house. You were reinventing that third space that people could go from their homes and from their offices and meet there, which was a neutral third space where they just served incredible coffee. And I said my grandfather liked music. I've seen some of the diaries for the events there, and there were like 3 or 4 events a week. It must have been exhausting. And he had all sorts of, I mean, Alan's already mentioned, he had all sorts of famous singers who came, but also he loved jazz. So when jazz arrived in Austria, much later, obviously, because it came from the US, he threw open his doors and invited jazz musicians in. And one of the things I love about that, first of all, is the fact that obviously the Nazis banned jazz, and he was, my grandfather was a staunch supporter of jazz. but my son has just started studying jazz, and it feels like there's this real connection that he's now studying something that my grandfather and his great-grandfather absolutely loved.
So I have a two-part question. In the book, you talk about, the famous apple strudel. And the first thing that came to my mind, and I don't know why, was the scene in Inglourious Bastards when Colonel Landa, and then later on in the book, you reference Inglourious Bastards. I'm thinking, okay, there's a connection between us, Meriel. And, again, French is a much nicer language than German. And if you remember that scene where he had Shoshana with him, and they bring the strudel, and he goes, you must put on, in the French, la crème. So I don't know if that's what they served also in Café Schindler, but to your knowledge, are there any other landmarks in Europe today that were started by Jews that are still standing, that have the same panache as Café Schindler?
I can't talk for the whole of Europe. That's above my pay grade, Alan. But I can talk for Innsbruck, and I think I'm pretty sure that the Café Schindler, and I'll say it is now still going. It'll be 100 years old next year in 2022, because it was founded in 1922, and it is, I think, the only previously Jewish-owned business that's still going. And the story of how it was reinvented by someone else is quite intriguing, in that what happened, obviously, it was taken away from the cafe was taken away from my grandfather during the war. As Bela said, it became a Nazi officers' drinking club. It was hugely successful in that guise. And then at the end of the war, 7 years later, for Austria at least, the Nazis all scarpered. The senior ones went into hiding, and very, very surprisingly, my grandfather chose to return to Austria. And very, very, very few Jews returned. And I think there were 2 families that returned to Innsbruck. The rest wouldn't have it was just inconceivable that they would return. Anyway, he chose to go back. I think he just loved the mountains, and he wanted his cafe back. And he was fairly confident, because he had friends, and he had a very, very loyal lawyer who had looked after him all the way through, and he got the cafe back. Sadly, he only lived until 1952. He died of a heart attack. And my father inherited the cafe, and that's when things went wrong. My father was a lousy businessman, and the cafe got sold. And then it disappeared off the high street. So when I said I was at school in Austria, at that point, there was no Café Schindler on the main high street. It just had lived on in people's heads. But roll on to 2016, when I returned to Innsbruck with my kids in tow and my husband, and I was regaling them with my normal stories about this cafe. Long before the book, and a year before my father died. And we were walking down the main high street, and I'm telling them that, their grandfather had this amazing cafe, no. And they're going, yeah, mum, yeah, mum, yeah, mum. And I look up, and there's the Café Schindler back. My name across the cafe in exactly the same building. So I storm across the road, and my kids are thinking, oh my God, she's going to make a scene. This is just going to be so embarrassing. Anyway, so I go up to the first floor, and I say, can I speak to the owner, please? And they say, oh, the owner's out, he's on holiday. And I think, okay, I know. And they say, what do you want? I said, well, my name's Schindler, huh? And they go, well, they give me his email address, and I get in touch via email. And there's a very tentative response, because my email has a lawyer sign off, and he's thinking, oh no, this Schindler's crawled out of the woodwork. She's going to demand some money. I had no interest in demanding money. I was just curious. And the following year, I meet the guy, and he's a young restaurateur. And he said, look, I didn't know anything about your family. I moved to Innsbruck from Salzburg, and I wanted to open a cafe, and it didn't matter who I asked. When I went to the planning office, when I went to the licensing office, when I talked to my brother-in-law, they all said, my friend, it's got to be called Café Schindler. It's like, who the hell are these people? Anyway, he went to the local archives, tapped in the name, and then realized that when the images all came back from the 1920s and 30s, there was a ready-made history. Like, you can't buy that kind of heritage.
Right.
So he decked it out in 1930s Art Deco style, and it's an incredible success. And I wish him every success with it. So I'm very pleased that it's there. I have no ambition to run a restaurant. I think I'd be terrible at it. So I'm very pleased that it's still there. And it says a little something about the resilience of Jewish business and commerce and important things like that. Because, you know, most of the Jewish businesses went bankrupt because they were starved of resource and funding, and then the names were changed. And so the fact that we've got something that is still operational is amazing. And certainly it's the only thing in Innsbruck. The rest of Europe, I don't know for certain.
Okay. Bela, you can go, and then we'll go ahead.
Yes. Okay. Meriel, your book focuses on what happened to the Jews of Western Austria during the lead up to the war. How do you think their experiences differ than that of Jews in other Nazi-occupied countries?
I think the Jews of Western Austria were particularly unlucky with their Gauleiter. So the Gauleiter was the regional governor, basically. And there were 42 of these regional governors throughout the German Reich, and they reported straight to Hitler. And I think the Jews of Western Austria, even though there were very few of them, were particularly unlucky in their Gauleiter because he was very obsessively pro-Hitler and anti-Jew. And it was basically a competition. He wanted to be the first Gauleiter to make his Gau, his province, Jew-free. So I think that they fared particularly badly, even though there were so few of them. And there's this real central conundrum that you could be so virulently opposed to people when there are so few of them and they're so inoffensive. And you know, it's one of those central puzzles, I think, of the history of that area. And when you look at Kristallnacht, the pogrom in November, it was one of the deadliest pogroms in the whole of the German Reich. So 2 Jews died that night. One was severely injured and died straight afterwards. And when you think about what the purpose of that pogrom was, it was not to murder or kill. That was not on the agenda at the time. The purpose was to scare the living daylights out of the Jews so that they left. That's what the official policy was. It was not a kill command. But in Innsbruck, they set out to kill people. They killed 2 on the night, 1 died shortly afterwards. And in relation to my grandfather, who was a very prominent Jew, he wasn't political, he ran a cafe. The order to the 5 or 6 or 7 people who went to beat him up was, if he dies, if he croaks, it was very colloquial, if he croaks, that's fine too. So there was a real insouciance about how badly they beat him up. If they left him for dead and he died, that was fine too. And so when you say, you know, how did it differ? I think it was a particularly vicious brand of anti-Semitism, which I think differed to some extent from the rest. And very early, it was very vicious.
I encourage our audience to purchase the Lost Café Schindler, One Family, 2 Wars, and the Search for Truth. Thank you, Meriel, for joining us today. Thank you to vinnews.com for hosting our show. And of course, thank you to our audience for tuning in.
Honor meeting you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to The Definitive Wrap with your hosts, Bela Sebro and Alan Skorsky. Be sure to tell your family and friends they also can listen to The Definitive Wrap on Apple Music, Spotify, Google Play, and your favorite streaming service. See you next time on The Definitive Wrap.